Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today I'm here with a review, sort of, and demo of this bottle of Noodler's Polar Green fountain pen ink. I've got this little Jinhao 82 with an extra fine nib, already inked up and ready to go. Now, I generally use my fountain pens for drawing and making art, and the main reason that I've gotten this particular ink is it is a green ink that is also supposed to be waterproof and light fast. So it should be an archival permanent ink. The idea being that if I decide to draw a picture or something and it's something that's good enough that I think it could be displayed, I should be able to display that art piece, frame it, what have you, and it should, hold up over time. The colors shouldn't fade and wash out. If something was to get on the piece of paper, it shouldn't just completely ruin the art piece, which is why I tend to have a lot of Noodler's inks for this reason, because Noodler's really has some of the largest selection of permanent, what they call bulletproof inks out there. And especially while there's a lot of options when it in terms of black inks and more in terms of like blues and blue blacks that are permanent, colored inks such as green or red or pink, purple, pick a color, are not as common. Now, the reason I'm going to just be using a extra fine nib for this, these polar inks are a little kind of notorious for being really wet flowing, potentially blotting, bleed through, and feathering. So from my own personal use using them, I would suggest using them in a finer nibbed pen like this extra fine, and maybe perhaps a drier pen, something like a Platinum Preppy. I do have one Platinum Preppy, but it's inked with a different ink right now, so I'm just going to use this one pen for this video. Now, the papers that I'm going to be using are this 20-pound copy paper. It's Pen Gear 20-pound copy paper from Walmart, the cheapest stuff I could get. I've got a Pen Gear composition notebook that I'll be writing in. And then I've got 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper, 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper, and 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. And those will be the papers that I'm going to test. I'm going to write on them in both cursive and in non-cursive. Because I am a little bit slower with my cursive writing, you're probably going to see more blotting and feathering and the negative effects of this ink in cursive, because I'm kind of slow doing that. And with the non-cursive writing, it's probably going to look pretty decent on most of these papers. So without further ado, let's get into the actual writing portion. Mississippi. So that actually seemed to absorb that fairly quickly. I am right. It did skip a few times. You're probably not going to get my lighting, as much as I've tried to light this well, is not the best. You're not going to get the best look at the actual hue of this. I do plan to photo scan these samples when I'm done, and put them in the video, the actual photo scans, but I would take that with a grain of salt as far as the colors of the ink, because not only can the photo scans change that color, but also depending on monitor settings and yada yada yada, blah blah blah, all that stuff that have to do with how your screen actually displays the picture can alter the way the hue and the color looks. But as you can, I'll go back to that. As you can see, there wasn't necessarily a lot of feather. Now there was some blotting, and you can see at the ends of some of the letters, like the top of that F, the bottom of that N on fountain, on that lower line. And if you look at the G and the R on green and the cursive writing at the ends of some of the letters, you can see that there's a blot, there's a dot. And if we flip this over, you will see anywhere where it blotted, it did actually bleed through on this copy paper. And you can see a pretty considerable amount of ghosting. Now the ghosting is not so severe that you could not write on the back, but the bleed through is pretty, obviously that's a problem. So if you were writing on a piece of copy paper with this ink, I probably wouldn't if you didn't have to. But if there's anything written on the backside or you need to write on the backside, you're going to have some problems. Alright, so next we're going to move on to the notebook. So this is the Pen Gear composition notebook. I'm going to do pretty much the same writing here. Mississippi. So, okay. With that, it is. So we'll take a look at that. I'm going to pull out this sheet. And I'm not going to be able to get this as well into the, because this is pretty rigid. It isn't a notebook instead of a loose leaf. I'm going to try to get it. So you can see, like towards the end there, especially on the cursive, it did indeed kind of soak up pretty quick, and it, but it did sort of flow a little. It's not necessarily that it feathered as much as the text kind of grew and got pretty woolly. So it doesn't look the best. The lines aren't as crisp. I don't think I would consider using this ink necessarily on a notebook. And I don't know how well this is going to show through, but yes, indeed, you will see that it did bleed through the notebook paper. So, the polar green ink on notebook paper is not recommended. So, the next paper I'm going to be using here is going to be the Blick white sulfite drawing paper, the 50-pound paper. Now, from my other tests that I've done before, okay, this should actually work fairly well on this paper. Mississippi. Okay. So here we go on the Blick paper. There is still on a couple of the at the ends of some of the letters, there is a bit of feathering and a little bit of blotting, but not as bad as on the other papers. Probably the worst is right there on the E and the F, especially that E. I don't know how well it's going to show up on camera. Still, it dries almost instantly. I couldn't get it to smear at all. And as far as the back, because this is a 50-pound paper, there is some ghosting on where the blotting occurred, but there is no bleed through. But I mean, this is a 50-pound paper, so you shouldn't really expect any bleed through on this. So the next paper we're going to do is this Koh-i-Noor sketch pad paper. should behave fairly well on this also, if I remember correctly. Okay, so on this, excuse the fact that I let myself get sidetracked here and write a couple words in cursive again. Now, there might be some places on this where you'll see something that could look a bit like feathering. It's not necessarily that it actually is feathering. This is a bit of a toothy paper. Okay, and the texture of the paper does cause the lines to be not quite as smooth. But one thing I did notice while I was writing this, though, is this paper did not as quickly, did not absorb the ink as quickly. So I actually was able to get a smear on this paper as opposed to the other two. And let's see the back. No real bleed through. There is some ghosting, but no real bleed through. So like I said, on this particular paper, this is alright, it's just fine. Now, another thing I didn't really get into yet, and because this is really the first time we've seen it, the other papers did not show really any kind of shading. There's a couple places on here where there's maybe some hints where it kind of almost wanted to shade, but generally speaking, this ink is just pretty much even toned all the time. So there's the Koh-i-Noor paper, and the last paper I've got is the Canson mixed media paper. So do this one, and then we should be done with the writing section. 10 Mississippi. Okay. Now, actually, out of all the papers so far, this is probably the best performing paper for this Polar ink. Now, once again, kind of like the Koh-i-Noor, this did not immediately suck up the ink. I did get a little bit of a smear here, and that's strips there is about a 10-second smear. Not terrible. It's still pretty fast drawing, and there is maybe some slight hints of shading. Might actually, no, they are dry pretty much, looks like. So there are some slight hints of shading on this particular paper towards the end of the letters. Just barely though. And it should not be even remotely visible. Yeah, it's a 98-pound piece of mixed media paper. It shouldn't have been visible on the back side. So there is the most of the writing test on those papers. So like I said, this ink can be a little bit finicky in terms of how it performs. Now, I think when I'm all said and done, I've got several other inks that I'm going to do tests with on these papers. So you can see I've got some dividing lines. This is the Blick 50-pound drawing paper. When I'm done using the other inks I'm going to do and fill this piece of paper up, my plan is to actually take this piece of paper and do a light fastness test where I'm going to tape this piece of paper up in the window on the south side of my house and leave it for like a month. And then I'm going to, after that period of time has elapsed, take the paper off, bring it back in here, do some writing with the same ink, and then compare and see what the potential degradation or fading may have occurred due to direct UV light exposure. So that is something that can be looked forward to in the future, hopefully. But I've got several other inks to actually make videos or tests on before that point. So I made an attempt to do a poor man's chromatography here with a strip of paper towel. I used a mixture of 70% isopropyl alcohol and water for this chromatography. You can see that there is a distinctly darker strip here at the bottom, if it shows pretty well, but which is where the initial strip was, but the rest of it is just essentially one hue of green that gets progressively lighter as you go up. So there's no real other discernible colors in this chromatography. Now, I know I did not use the best paper for this, but I did several other chromatographies where there is an actual chromatic change in the colors based on the components of the ink. So this being pretty much green throughout, you know, if somebody did a more proper version of a test with more proper paper, it might show something else, but it's pretty much just consistently the same hue of green throughout. Now I'm going to do a real quick water test. This is just a cut off piece of 20-pound copy paper. So I waited about 30 seconds to drip water on that. I left it on there about 10 seconds. Pushed it in and blotted it off with a paper towel, and as you can see, don't really see any evidence of this having moved. So as far as it being waterproof, it is a quick drying ink, and it does seem to be waterproof. So that does it for my ink test. I'm gonna want to thank everybody that watched, especially if you watched this far and watched all the way to the end. Thank you very much. I hope that this video was informative to some, to kind of showcase the ink and sort of what it does, how it behaves on some papers. I know the big papers that people wanted to see, I didn't use, your Rhodius, Tomoe Rivers, Moleskines, etc. But like I said, for my use, the papers that I showcased in this video are the papers that I generally use with my pens and my inks. So anyways, if you liked it, I'd appreciate you liking the videos. Drop a comment down below, tell me what you liked, what you didn't like. If you've got you know, suggestions on how I can make the videos better, or other things like that. And if you really liked it, you think I did a halfway decent job, then, you know, maybe subscribe. It really helps me out, and any kind of engagement and interaction on these videos will help me out greatly. So thank you, and until the next video, bye bye.